Now, today you're going to talk about something very interesting in your virtual tour of Waterford Treasures, and this is all about New Geneva, an experiment in the 18th century to build a new town for Swiss clock and watchmakers near Passage East.
That's right, Mary, and everybody today, of course, in Waterford and City and County will know it as Geneva Barracks, where there's a farm there at the moment, but it didn't start off as that, and the reason it's called Geneva Barracks is, as you say, there was an experiment in the early 1780s, around the same time as Waterford Glass was founded here in Waterford. So they were experimenting with all sorts of industrial ideas, and basically the Irish government at the time, we did have our own parliament at the time and House of Lords, the Irish government at the time wanted to bring in Swiss watch and clockmakers into what's New Geneva down near Passage. Passage was going to be the port of this new town, and essentially, without going into the great detail of it, there was a big dispute out in Geneva between basically the ruling class. Geneva was fairly democratic for the time, but there was a ruling class of merchants, very kind of almost saw themselves a bit aristocratic, and then there was the underclass of workers and craftsmen and tradesmen. They were wealthy enough people, but they decided that they split with the ruling class, and they decided they were going to go off, leave Geneva and bring their skill with them of making clocks and watches. So I suppose if this had come through, we probably wouldn't be in Waterford City today. We'd all be out at near Passage there in a new town.
What would the goats think?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and the fascinating thing about this, we're going to do a big exhibition on it as part of our Clock and Watch Museum. We have two things on loan from people. The actual trowel that was used to lay the foundation stone, they did build buildings out there. It was quite advanced, and we have a painting of a man called Bellamy. It was bought from an auction in Switzerland, and he was one of the watchmakers who came over here. We know he spent 9 years in Ireland, and he obviously painted a lovely view of Passage. He was obviously wanting to show his people back home, this is what the port of the new town was going to look like, because Passage East was going to be the port. There's a lot there, and we have this lovely painting. It's only 4 inches, of an architect who was very involved with the building of the town, and we have actually the drawings of the new town. This architect is there. It's only 4 inches, but you can actually see he worked on the Custom House in Dublin. You can see it in the painting. He's working on the Customs House, and his calipers and his pencils and pens and all the rest of it in this tiny little picture. And his name is Edward Smith. He was a son of a stone carver. Of course, they needed the government on board, and they needed aristocracy on board. And the man who ruled Ireland at the time on behalf of the king was called Lord Temple. And this man was also a stone carver as well as a sculptor. And he commissioned a statue of Lord Temple to go into the middle of the main street of this new city, or town, out at New Geneva. The sculpture was done, but it never got there. It's now in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. So there was a lot of energy put into it. And of course, they were trying to flatter, of course, the governor of Ireland so that he would support the scheme. And the government was going to give them £50,000 pounds at the time. It's a huge amount of money to bring over these artisans from Geneva.
It's an amazing undertaking, really. So
yeah,
the gist and the idea behind it all, was it just to get these people here? Or
oh yeah, the government, because they wanted, these were, you think of it, we try to bring in computer factories nowadays. You think of a little watch and think of the technology that goes into making that watch. These were the most supreme craftsmen. There's no better craftsmen in the world than watchmakers in the 18th century. And you think that was the technology. Only the richest of the rich could afford a watch.
IDA ahead of their time.
Encased in silver and gold cases. And they even had an assay office, so they didn't have to go to Dublin to do it. And sadly, it didn't work. I mean, there's lovely records of it all, but they come in here to Waterford and names the men who came here. They took up lodgings in Colbeck Street, and they were negotiating away and all the rest of it. So it's a fascinating story. And imagine if it had happened, you'd have had this beautiful big Georgian town, by the greatest architect. And Gandon was some of the drawings, and actually we have the drawings as well. Yeah.
That's really simple. But how come it didn't work?
Essentially what happened was the dispute out in Geneva itself kind of sort of resolved itself, but also they wanted all sorts of rights and privileges, and the British government and the Irish government, they were one and the same. The Irish government at the time didn't really want to give it to them. They wanted the rights to, they didn't want any interference at all, basically, from the government in Dublin, and the kind of negotiations.
They kind of wanted autonomy, sort of.
Yeah, they did almost total autonomy, and basically then what happened was, then, as with all these things, people drive things, and the people who drove them then lost interest, and the thing just fizzled out. And the man who actually did the painting of Passage went back to Switzerland and brought the painting back to Geneva with him. But luckily it's back in Ireland again now, and on loan to us by a very generous Waterford man.
Brilliant, Eamonn.
What could have been, Eamonn?
Yeah, what could have been.
Exactly. Thanks a million, Eamonn. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Take care.
Bye-bye.